My landlord tried evicting me with false violations over race, but my aunt's a housing attorney. The eviction notice was taped to my door at 6:18 a.m. on a Friday, right above the mezuzah my grandmother gave me when I moved in. I know the exact time because my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the doorbell camera I'd installed 3 months earlier. The same camera that would later save my entire life. The notice cited 17 building code violations, each one more absurd than the last. Unauthorized structural modifications, excessive noise complaints, unsanitary conditions, and my personal favorite, operating an unlicensed automotive repair facility. I lived in a 650-square-foot studio apartment in a renovated factory building in Oakland. I didn't even own a car. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my coffee mug, and it shattered across the kitchen tile in a pattern that looked like a crime scene. That's when I knew this wasn't a mistake. I'd been renting apartment 3C at the Meridian Lofts for 11 months when Gerald Thornberry bought the building. Before that, the place was owned by a property management company that barely remembered I existed as long as the rent cleared on the first of every month. I was the model tenant, now worse, paid early, kept to myself, worked from home as a software developer for a cybersecurity firm. My neighbors knew me as the quiet guy who always held the elevator and occasionally left homemade cookies in the mailroom during holidays. I'd moved to Oakland after college, drawn by the tech industry and the city's reputation for diversity. My parents had immigrated from Ethiopia when I was 2, and I'd grown up in a predominantly white suburb of Seattle where I'd learned to make myself invisible. Oakland felt different. It felt like home. Or it did, until Thornberry showed up. Gerald Thornberry was a real estate developer from Orange County who specialized in what he called urban renewal projects, buying older buildings in gentrifying neighborhoods and converting them into luxury condos. He was 63, with silver hair styled like a news anchor, and a collection of polo shirts in every pastel shade imaginable. He wore loafers without socks, even in winter. The first time I met him was in the lobby on a Monday morning in early September, 2 weeks after he'd purchased the building. He was measuring the mailroom with a laser device, muttering about wasted space and revenue optimization. When I introduced myself and extended my hand, he looked at it for 3 full seconds before shaking it limply. "You're in 3C?" he asked, checking something on his tablet. "Month-to-month lease?" I explained I was on a year lease that didn't expire until June. He smiled, not with his eyes, and said, "We'll see about that." I should have called my aunt right then. The first violation notice arrived 9 days later. It was slipped under my door on a Wednesday evening while I was at the grocery store, a single sheet of paper claiming I'd violated quiet hours by playing loud music at 2 a.m. the previous night. I'd been asleep at 2 a.m. I'd been asleep by 10:30 p.m. because I had an early morning meeting with clients in Singapore. I marched down to Thornberry's temporary office on the first floor, the notice crumpled in my fist, ready to clear up what had to be a mistake. His assistant, a blonde woman in her 20s who introduced herself as Kimberly, took the notice, glanced at it, and said she'd look into it. Thornberry appeared in the doorway behind her, coffee in hand, and I saw something flicker across his face when he saw me. Not surprise, recognition, like he'd been waiting for this exact moment. "Mr. Desta," he said, pronouncing my last name with exaggerated care, each syllable crisp and separate. "We've been getting complaints." I asked who complained. He smiled again. "We protect our residents' privacy." I walked back upstairs with my stomach in knots. The second violation arrived 4 days later. This one claimed I was storing flammable materials in violation of fire code. The evidence? A photograph of my apartment door from the hallway, zoomed in on the small decorative wreath my mother had sent me, made of dried eucalyptus and lavender. The notice stated that combustible decorations in common areas pose an immediate fire hazard and demanded removal within 24 hours or face a $250 fine. I removed the wreath. I took a photo of the bare door. I emailed it to the building management address listed on the notice. 3 days later, I received a violation for unauthorized removal of building property. Apparently, the wreath had been affixed with hardware that damaged paint and drywall. The fine was now $500. I started documenting everything. Every email, every notice, every interaction. My apartment became a command center of folders and screenshots and time-stamped photographs. My coworker Jamal asked me why I looked exhausted during a video call. I told him landlord issues. He said, "Man, is this a race thing?" I said I didn't know. But I was starting to. The escalation followed a pattern I didn't recognize until later, when my aunt laid it out in her office with the mechanical precision of someone who'd seen this exact playbook 100 times. Every 4 to 5 days, a new violation. Each one more specific, more targeted, more impossible to disprove. Unauthorized guests. I'd had no guests. Improper trash disposal. I'd photographed every bag I'd taken to the shoot. Suspicious odors. I didn't cook with spices because my kitchen had 1 burner and terrible ventilation. The notices always arrived when I wasn't home, always slipped under the door or taped up in the early morning hours. I installed a second camera inside my apartment, aimed at the door. On October 3rd at 4:47 a.m., the footage showed Thornberry himself, in a gray sweatshirt and khakis, crouching outside my door with a clipboard and camera. He took 17 photos of my door, my doormat, the empty hallway. Then he pressed his ear against the door for almost 2 minutes. I was inside. asleep. The next violation arrived that afternoon, claiming I was operating an unpermitted business from the apartment based on excessive electronic equipment and unusual foot traffic. I finally called my aunt on October 8th, after the 9th violation notice. Ayana Gurma was my father's younger sister, a housing rights attorney in San Francisco, who specialized in tenant defense and fair housing litigation. She'd built her practice from scratch after spending 5 years with the Bay Area Legal Aid, and she had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless in court. When we were kids, she used to tell me and my cousins stories about fighting slumlords and winning cases against massive property management corporations. My dad called her the family pit bull, which she took as a compliment. I sat in my car outside a coffee shop in downtown Oakland, engine running, and told her everything. The violations, the photos, the camera footage, the way Thornberry looked at me. There was a long pause after I finished, and then she said, "Isaiah, I need you to listen to me very carefully. This isn't about building codes. This is a targeted harassment campaign designed to force you out, and the racial component makes it a federal fair housing violation. I'm coming to Oakland tomorrow. Don't sign anything, don't respond to any more notices, and for God's sake, don't move out." Ayana showed up at my apartment at 9 a.m. on October 9th with a leather briefcase and the focused energy of a prosecutor entering a courtroom. She was 41, short, like most of the women in our family, with natural hair she wore in thick locks and a wardrobe of exclusively black, gray, and navy suits. She walked through my apartment like a crime scene investigator, photographing everything: the spotless kitchen, the neatly organized shelves, the minimal furniture, the computer setup on my desk. She reviewed every violation notice, spreading them across my coffee table in chronological order. Then she pulled out her laptop and showed me something I'd never seen: the building's purchase records, publicly available through the county assessor's office. Thornberry had bought the Meridian Lofts for $8.2 million in August. The building had 63 units. 58 were rent-controlled. Of those 58, 42 were occupied by people of color. Of the 19 remaining tenants on long-term leases, 16 were people of color. I was one of them. "This is a clearing operation," Ayana said, tapping her pen on the table. "He wants the rent-controlled tenants out so he can renovate and flip to market-rate luxury rentals. But he can't just evict everyone. California has strong tenant protections, so he targets the most vulnerable residents, manufactures violations, creates paper trails, and makes your life so miserable you leave voluntarily." The 10th violation arrived on October 12th, and this one was different. It wasn't slipped under my door or taped to the frame. It was hand-delivered by a uniformed Oakland police officer at 7:23 p.m., accompanied by a noise complaint investigation form and a warning about continued disturbances to building residents. The officer, his badge read Officer D. Stevens, looked apologetic as he explained that multiple residents had filed complaints about loud music, shouting, and aggressive behavior coming from my apartment. I invited him inside. He looked around at my silent, immaculate studio, at the noise meter Ayana had installed that showed ambient sound at 32 decibels, at the camera footage queued up on my laptop. "Sir," he said, after a long pause, "I don't see any evidence of what was described in the complaint, but I have to file a report because the call came in." I asked who filed the complaint. He hesitated. "The building owner filed on behalf of multiple anonymous residents." Ayana had warned me this would happen. She'd said, "Once they involve law enforcement, they're building a case for eviction based on lease violations and nuisance claims. They need an official record from the police to make it stick in housing court." I asked Officer Stevens if he could note in his report that the apartment was quiet and clean. He said he would. Then he left, and I sat on my couch in the dark for 2 hours, too angry to move. Ayana filed the first legal motion on October 14th, a cease and desist letter delivered via certified mail and email to Gerald Thornberry, the Meridian Lofts Management Company, and their attorney. The letter, 7 pages long, documented every violation notice, the timeline of harassment, the video evidence of Thornberry conducting surveillance outside my door, and a detailed analysis of the demographics of targeted tenants in the building. It cited California's Fair Employment and Housing Act, the Federal Fair Housing Act, and 3 previous cases where Ayana had won substantial settlements against landlords engaged in discriminatory practices. The letter demanded an immediate halt to all violation notices, the removal of all existing violations from my tenant record, and a formal apology. It also informed them that we were prepared to file a federal civil rights lawsuit if the harassment continued. Ayana CC'd the email to the Oakland City Attorney's Office and the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing. "We're putting them on notice," she explained, sitting across from me at a Vietnamese restaurant near my apartment. "Now everything they do is documented evidence of retaliation. They're going to lawyer up and come at us hard, but we've got them on the defensive." I asked what happened if they just tried to evict me anyway. She smiled. "Then we take them to court and ruin them." The retaliation started 36 hours later. On October 16th at 2:17 p.m., I received an email from building management stating that my lease was being terminated effective November 30th due to material breach of lease terms, repeated violations of building policies, and patterns of behavior incompatible with community standards. Attached was a 43-page document titled Resident Violation History and Termination Justification, which included every single violation notice, Photographs of my apartment door from multiple angles, copies of the noise complaint filed with OPD, and a detailed log of disturbances allegedly documented by other residents. The document also included something new. Statements from 3 neighbors claiming I'd been hostile and intimidating in common areas, that I'd damaged shared facilities, and that my presence made them feel unsafe. The statements weren't signed. They weren't dated. They just existed, like evidence from a ghost. Ayana called me within 10 minutes of receiving the forwarded email. "They just handed us a lawsuit on a silver platter," she said. "Those anonymous statements, inadmissible, the violation notices, we've got video proof they're fabricated. The timing, 24 hours after receiving our cease and desist, textbook retaliation. Isaiah, we're going to federal court." The lawsuit was filed on October 21st in the United States District Court for the Northern District of California, Isaiah Desta versus Gerald Thornberry, Meridian Property Holdings LLC, and Thornberry Development Group. The complaint was 67 pages long and included 8 causes of action: violation of the Fair Housing Act based on racial discrimination, violation of California's Fair Employment and Housing Act, intentional infliction of emotional distress, harassment, retaliation, breach of implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing, fraudulent documentation, and violation of Oakland's Tenant Protection Ordinance. Ayana had spent 4 days drafting it, working through the night on 3 of them, fueled by Ethiopian coffee and righteous fury. The complaint included everything: the timeline of violations, Thornberry's purchase strategy targeting rent-controlled units occupied by people of color, the video evidence of his surveillance outside my door, the fabricated noise complaints, the anonymous statements, and expert testimony from Dr. Helena Ruiz, a housing discrimination specialist and professor at UC Berkeley School of Law. Dr. Ruiz had reviewed the case files and provided a 23-page expert opinion concluding that the pattern of harassment I'd experienced was consistent with established discriminatory practices designed to force minority tenants from rent-controlled housing units. The filing made local news within hours. The media attention was immediate and overwhelming. By October 22nd, the story had been picked up by the San Francisco Chronicle, the East Bay Times, and 3 local TV news stations. By October 23rd, it was trending on Twitter under hashtag Meridian Lofts Scandal and had been covered by NPR's Bay Area affiliate. The narrative was simple and damning. Wealthy white developer buys building in diverse neighborhood, systematically targets black and brown tenants with fabricated violations to clear building for luxury condos, gets caught on camera conducting surveillance. Reporters started camping outside the Meridian Lofts. Thornberry's attorney issued a statement calling the lawsuit frivolous and defamatory, claiming that all violation notices were legitimate responses to documented lease violations, and that any suggestion of racial motivation was deeply offensive and categorically false. The statement also noted that Thornberry Development Group had a long history of supporting diverse communities and had won awards for affordable housing projects in Orange County. Ayana released a counter-statement pointing out that none of those affordable housing projects actually housed low-income residents. They were tax credit schemes that technically qualified as affordable but rented at market rates. On October 25th, I received a phone call from a woman named Diana Ortega, a senior investigator with the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing. She explained that DFEH had opened an independent investigation into Thornberry Development Group based on our complaint and the publicity surrounding the case. She asked if I'd be willing to meet with her and provide a full statement, along with access to all documentation and video evidence. I met her 2 days later at a DFEH office in downtown Oakland. Diana Ortega was in her early 50s, with graying black hair pulled into a tight bun and a leather folder containing what looked like hundreds of pages of notes. She spent 3 hours interviewing me, recording the entire conversation, reviewing every violation notice, watching the footage of Thornberry outside my door, and taking extensive notes on a yellow legal pad. At the end, she asked, "Mr. Desta, have you experienced any other incidents of harassment or discrimination from Mr. Thornberry or his staff that you haven't documented?" I told her about the time Kimberly, his assistant, had asked me where I was really from when I'd gone to the office to ask about a package delivery. Diana wrote it down. Then she said, "We're going to need to interview other tenants in the building. Would you be comfortable helping us identify residents who might have similar experiences?" The other tenants started coming forward on October 28th. Ayana had already suspected there were others. Her analysis of the building records showed at least 7 other long-term tenants who fit the profile of targeted harassment, but we didn't have proof until Diana Ortega's investigation started making calls. The first was Lucia Fernandez, a 68-year-old widow in apartment 2B who'd lived in the building for 19 years. She'd received 14 violation notices in 6 weeks, including citations for excessive water usage. She took 3 showers a week to save money, unauthorized pets, she had no pets, and loitering in common areas. She sat in the lobby because her apartment had no air conditioning. The second was Darren Thompson, a black veteran in apartment 4F who worked night shifts as a hospital security guard. His violation notices accused him of suspicious late-night activity, unauthorized visitors, his visiting nurse came twice a week for a service-connected disability, and aggressive behavior toward staff. He'd asked Thornberry to fix a leaking pipe. The third was May Chenna. Wait, I can't use that name. The third was Jennifer Wu, a graduate student in apartment 1A who'd received notices about cooking odors that violate community standards, despite having barely used her kitchen. All three had received lease termination notices in October. All three were people of color. All three were on rent-controlled leases. By November 1st, the DFEH investigation had identified 11 tenants who'd experienced similar harassment patterns. Ayana filed an amended complaint, adding 6 of them as co-plaintiffs, transforming the lawsuit from an individual case into a class-action civil rights lawsuit. The amended complaint was 134 pages and included testimony from all 11 tenants, comparative analysis showing that 0 white tenants on equivalent lease terms had received violation notices during the same period, email evidence from Thornberry's files obtained through discovery showing discussions about clearing legacy tenants and optimizing resident demographics, and expert testimony from Dr. Lawrence Franklin, a forensic economist who calculated that Thornberry's scheme would have generated an additional $3.7 million in annual rental income once rent-controlled tenants were replaced with market-rate renters. The smoking gun was an email dated August 15th, sent from Thornberry to his business partner and CFO named Dennis Kolb. The email, discussing the Meridian Lofts purchase, included the line, "Most of the rent-controlled units are occupied by Section 8 and ethnic tenants. Should clear easily once we establish violation patterns. Usual playbook." Ayana read that email aloud in a press conference on the steps of the federal courthouse. The video went viral. The tenant organizing started organically in early November, after the amended lawsuit was filed, and the media coverage intensified. Lucia Fernandez knocked on my door one evening with a handwritten invitation to a meeting in the building's community room, which Thornberry had been trying to convert into a fitness center for premium residents. 8 of us showed up that first night. Me, Lucia, Darren, Jennifer, and 4 other tenants who'd been named in the lawsuit. We sat in a circle on folding chairs that Darren had borrowed from his church, and for 2 hours we just talked. We talked about the violation notices, the sleepless nights, the fear of losing our homes, the humiliation of being treated like criminals in our own building. We talked about what it felt like to be targeted specifically because of our race, our ethnicity, our immigrant status. Jennifer cried, describing how her parents had immigrated from Taiwan in the 1990s, worked 2 jobs each to send her to college, and how she'd called her mother sobbing after receiving the eviction notice, terrified she'd disappoint them by losing her apartment. Darren talked about serving 2 tours in Afghanistan, coming home with PTSD and a service-connected disability, and how Thornberry's harassment had triggered symptoms he hadn't experienced in years. Lucia spoke in halting English about how she'd moved to the United States from El Salvador in 1987, lost her husband to cancer in 2006, and how the Meridian Lofts had been the only stable home she'd had in decades. By the end of that first meeting, we'd decided to form a tenant association, not just to support the lawsuit, but to create something lasting that would protect residents even after Thornberry was gone. The Meridian Tenants Alliance held its first official meeting on November 12th, with 17 residents in attendance, all the plaintiffs plus 6 additional tenants who'd heard about the group and wanted to join. We elected officers. Darren became president, Jennifer was secretary, and I volunteered as treasurer. We drafted bylaws, established monthly meeting schedules, and created a communication system using a private group chat and email list. More importantly, we started documenting everything about the building, every maintenance issue, every interaction with management, every decision about repairs or renovations. Ayana had taught us that documentation was power, that patterns only became visible when you wrote them down and compared notes. Within 3 weeks, the Alliance had compiled a 47-page report documenting years of neglected maintenance in units occupied by tenants of color, while units occupied by white tenants received prompt repairs and upgrades. The report included photographs, timestamps, copies of maintenance requests, and comparative data that made the discrimination pattern undeniable. We submitted the report to the nonprofit organization that had purchased the building, and within a month, they'd allocated $180,000 for building-wide repairs and upgrades, prioritizing the units that had been most neglected under Thornberry's ownership. The trial was scheduled for February, but it never made it that far. On November 18th, 3 things happened simultaneously. First, the Oakland City Attorney's Office filed criminal charges against Gerald Thornberry for 4 counts of filing false police reports based on the fabricated noise complaints he'd submitted to OPD. Second, the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing issued a determination finding substantial evidence of systemic housing discrimination and imposed $470,000 in civil penalties against Thornberry Development Group, pending the outcome of federal proceedings. Third, the FBI opened an investigation into potential wire fraud and bank fraud related to Thornberry's financing arrangements. Apparently, he'd secured the $8.2 million purchase loan by misrepresenting his intended use of the property to the lenders, claiming he would maintain affordable housing units when his actual plan was full conversion to luxury market-rate rentals. Bank fraud is a federal crime with a maximum sentence of 30 years. Ayana called me at work and said, "They're going to settle. They have no choice." I asked her what that meant. She said, "It means we won." The settlement negotiations took 11 days. Thornberry's attorneys tried everything. They offered to withdraw all violation notices and lease terminations, but pay no damages. They offered a small cash settlement in exchange for all plaintiffs signing non-disclosure agreements. They even tried to argue that the email about ethnic tenants was taken out of context and referred to ethnic restaurants in the neighborhood. Ayana rejected everything. Her settlement demands were non-negotiable. Full dismissal of all violation notices and lease terminations for all 11 plaintiff tenants. 5-year lease guarantees at current rent-controlled rates for all plaintiffs who chose to stay. $50,000 in compensatory damages per plaintiff. An additional $200,000 in punitive damages to be paid to me specifically as the named plaintiff. Mandatory anti-discrimination training for all Thornberry Development Group staff and contractors. Independent monitoring of the Meridian Loft's tenant management practices for 3 years. A public apology from Gerald Thornberry. And Ayana's legal fees and costs, which totaled $127,000. The alternative, she explained to their attorneys, was proceeding to trial with wall-to-wall media coverage, a strong likelihood of jury verdict substantially exceeding settlement amounts, and the certainty that federal criminal proceedings would destroy what remained of Thornberry's reputation and business. They settled on November 29th. The deposition process had been brutal. It took place over 3 days in late October at a conference room in a downtown Oakland office building, with Thornberry's defense attorneys, a team of 4 from a major San Francisco firm, conducting the questioning. Lead counsel was a man named Jeffrey Ashford, 60-something with gray temples and expensive suits, who specialized in defending corporations against discrimination claims. He'd clearly researched me thoroughly because he knew details about my life I'd never mentioned in any court filing. He asked about my immigration status. I was born in the United States. He asked about my employment history, trying to suggest I'd been fired from previous jobs. I hadn't. He asked detailed questions about my daily routine, trying to find inconsistencies between my testimony and the violation notices. He spent 40 minutes questioning me about a single evening in late September, going through my calendar, my email timestamps, my phone location data, trying to catch me in a lie about where I'd been when a noise complaint was filed. Ayana objected 17 times during that session alone. At one point, Ashford asked me, "Mr. Desta, isn't it true that you've been looking for reasons to claim discrimination? That you've been hypersensitive to normal landlord-tenant interactions because of your background?" I stared at him for 5 seconds before answering. "Mr. Ashford, I have video footage of your client conducting surveillance outside my door at 4:47 in the morning. I have fabricated violation notices that cite violations I didn't commit on dates when I can prove I wasn't even in my apartment. I have an email from your client referring to me and other tenants as ethnic tenants who should clear easily. If that's normal landlord-tenant interaction in your world, then yes, I'm hypersensitive to it." The media attention created its own complications. After the press conference where Ayana read the ethnic tenant's email, reporters started camping outside the Meridian Lofts and showing up at Thornberry's office. Local news crews interviewed tenants in the building, most of whom supported us, but some of whom, specifically white tenants in market-rate units, defended Thornberry and claimed the lawsuit was overblown or politically motivated. One tenant, a man in his 30s who'd moved in just 2 months earlier and was paying $3,400 for a one-bedroom, told a reporter that he'd never witnessed any discrimination and that Thornberry was just trying to maintain building standards. The clip aired on the evening news. Jennifer saw it and had a breakdown, calling me at midnight crying so hard she could barely speak. "He's calling us liars," she kept saying. "On television. He's calling us liars." I spent an hour on the phone with her, then drove to her apartment and sat with her until 3 a.m., while she processed the rage and humiliation of being publicly dismissed by someone who'd never experienced what we'd been through. The worst media moment came when a conservative news blog published an article titled "Activist Tenants Wage Lawsuit Against Landlord Trying to Improve Property Values," which included photographs of all 11 plaintiffs, our faces pulled from social media, alongside language suggesting we were gaming the system to avoid eviction for legitimate lease violations. The article was shared thousands of times and generated hundreds of racist comments. Ayana immediately sent cease and desist letters threatening defamation lawsuits, and the blog eventually removed the article, but the damage was done. My parents saw the article. My grandmother saw it. I got messages from people I'd gone to high school with asking if I was that guy from the lawsuit. The exposure felt like a secondary violation. The settlement agreement was signed on December 3rd in a conference room at Ayana's law office in San Francisco. Thornberry wasn't there. His attorneys signed on his behalf, but Dennis Kolb, the business partner who'd received that damning email, showed up in person, looking like he hadn't slept in days. The entire process took 40 minutes. Ayana reviewed each provision of the agreement, confirmed that all 11 plaintiffs understood and accepted the terms, and collected signatures on documents that had been reviewed by 3 different attorneys. The cashier's checks totaling $850,000 were handed over in a manila envelope. The public apology was issued via press release that afternoon, though it was clearly written by attorneys and carefully avoided admitting actual guilt. Instead, it expressed regret for misunderstandings and commitment to improved communication with all residents. But none of that mattered, because by the time the settlement was finalized, Gerald Thornberry's life had already imploded in ways that money couldn't fix. The Oakland City criminal charges were still pending. The FBI investigation was still active, and 3 banks that had provided financing for his other development projects had called their loans immediately after the DFEH determination, citing material misrepresentation in loan applications. The FBI case moved forward with startling speed. On December 14th, Federal agents executed search warrants at Thornberry Development Group's offices in Orange County, seizing computers, files, and financial records. The investigation had expanded beyond the Meridian Lofts to include 4 other properties Thornberry had purchased in Oakland, San Francisco, and Los Angeles over the previous 3 years. The pattern was identical in each case. Purchase buildings with high percentages of rent-controlled tenants of color, manufacture violation notices and harassment campaigns, force tenants out, renovate, and flip to luxury market rate. What made it federal bank fraud was that Thornberry had secured purchase loans for all 5 properties by representing to lenders that he would maintain affordable housing units and comply with local rent control ordinances, representations he'd made in writing, under penalty of perjury, in loan applications. He'd then systematically violated those representations while collecting rental income that exceeded his loan projections by millions of dollars. On January 8th, Gerald Thornberry was indicted by a federal grand jury on 17 counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and making false statements to financial institutions. His bail was set at $500,000. The FBI investigation uncovered details that made even Ayanna pause when she reviewed the evidence files. Special Agent Marcus Ayao, actually, I need a different name, Ayao. Special Agent Kevin Briggs, a 15-year veteran of the FBI's white-collar crime division, had been assigned to lead the case. He'd subpoenaed Thornberry's business emails, text messages, and financial records going back 5 years. What emerged was a systematic operation that Thornberry had refined over multiple properties. The seized computers contained spreadsheets tracking each building's demographics by unit, with color-coded markers indicating priority clearance targets, exclusively tenants of color, on rent-controlled leases. There were template violation notices stored in shared folders, with blank spaces for inserting tenant names and fabricated details. Most damning was a series of text messages between Thornberry and Dennis Kolb discussing specific tenants by race and ethnicity, with Kolb at one point texting, "The black guy in 4F is fighting back. Escalate to police complaints?" Thornberry's response, "Already done. They always fold once cops get involved." Agent Briggs told Ayanna during a meeting in early January that in his 15 years investigating financial fraud, he'd rarely seen such explicit documentation of discriminatory intent. Criminals usually tried to hide their motivations. Thornberry had been so confident in his system that he'd documented everything. I watched the news coverage of his arrest from my apartment, still mine, guaranteed for 5 years at $1,100 per month, while comparable units in the building were now listed at $3,200. The footage showed Thornberry being walked out of his home in handcuffs, his silver hair disheveled, wearing a wrinkled polo shirt, and the expression of a man whose entire world had collapsed in 4 months. The news anchors described him as a disgraced developer and alleged fraudster. His business partner, Dennis Kolb, had already taken a plea deal in exchange for testimony. Thornberry Development Group had filed for bankruptcy. The Meridian Lofts and Thornberry's 4 other Bay Area properties had been sold to a non-profit affordable housing organization as part of the bankruptcy settlement, ensuring they'd remain rent-controlled in perpetuity. I felt nothing watching the footage. Not satisfaction, not vindication. Just a strange, hollow numbness and the lingering exhaustion of 4 months spent fighting a battle I'd never asked for. Ayanna had warned me that winning wouldn't feel the way I expected. She was right. The panic attacks started in mid-January, about a month after the settlement was finalized. The first one hit while I was in a supermarket, reaching for coffee on a top shelf, when I heard footsteps behind me and whipped around so fast I knocked over a display of cereal boxes. My heart was racing, my hands were shaking, and I couldn't catch my breath. The security guard asked if I was okay. I said I was fine. I wasn't fine. The second attack happened 3 days later during a video call with my team at work, triggered by an email notification that popped up on my screen. For a split second, before I could read the sender's name, my body convinced itself it was another violation notice. I had to mute my microphone and turn off my camera while I wrote out 10 minutes of hyperventilating into my hands. My coworker Jamal messaged me afterward asking if everything was okay. I told him I'd had a bad connection. I was lying to everyone, including myself, about how much damage those 4 months had done. Ayanna noticed during a meeting in late January to discuss the Meridian Defense Initiative. She stopped mid-sentence, looked at me across her desk, and said, "Isaiah, you need to talk to someone, a professional. This isn't going to just go away because we won the case." I told her I was handling it. She pulled out a business card and slid it across the desk. Dr. Amanda Cross, licensed clinical psychologist, specializing in trauma and PTSD. I put the card in my wallet and didn't call for 2 weeks. Dr. Cross's office was in Berkeley, a small practice in a converted Victorian house near campus. I made the appointment on February 6th, drove there in silence, and almost turned around 3 times before finally parking and walking inside. Dr. Cross was in her mid-40s, black, with short natural hair and wire-rimmed glasses that made her look like a professor. She didn't ask me to lie on a couch or dive immediately into my childhood trauma. She just asked me to tell her what brought me in. I told her about the eviction notice, the violations, the lawsuit, the settlement, and the panic attacks. Then I told her something I hadn't told anyone, not even Ayanna. I'd stopped sleeping in my bedroom. I'd been sleeping on the couch for 6 weeks because the bedroom window faced the hallway, and every time I heard footsteps or voices outside, my body flooded with adrenaline and I couldn't settle down. Dr. Cross nodded and wrote something in her notepad. Then she said, "Isaiah, what you're describing is a textbook trauma response. Your nervous system learned that your home wasn't safe, that authority figures could be threats, and that the systems designed to protect you could be weaponized against you. Your body is still operating under those assumptions, even though the immediate threat is gone. That's not weakness. That's how trauma works." I broke down crying in her office for 20 minutes. It was the first time I'd cried since the day I got the eviction notice. The Oakland criminal trial for filing false police reports concluded on February 23rd. Thornberry was convicted on all 4 counts and sentenced to 18 months in county jail, though his attorney immediately filed an appeal. The federal bank fraud trial was scheduled for May, but his attorneys were negotiating a plea deal that would likely result in 4 to 6 years in federal prison. I didn't plan to attend either trial. I'd given my depositions, provided my testimony, turned over every piece of evidence. My part was done. But on March 12th, I received a phone call from an assistant United States attorney named Rachel Bowen, asking if I'd be willing to testify at Thornberry's sentencing hearing if he accepted the plea deal. She explained that victim impact statements often influenced sentencing outcomes, and that my testimony, as the named plaintiff in the civil case and the tenant whose evidence had triggered the federal investigation, would carry significant weight. I asked Ayanna what she thought. She said, "Do you want him to hear directly from you what he did?" I thought about it for 3 days. Then I said yes. The federal plea hearing was held on April 17th at the United States District Court in Oakland. Gerald Thornberry pleaded guilty to 9 counts of wire fraud and 3 counts of bank fraud, with the remaining charges dismissed as part of the agreement. The prosecution recommended 68 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years supervised release and $4.3 million in restitution to be paid to the defrauded banks and displaced tenants. Thornberry stood before Judge Alice Langford, a 72-year-old former civil rights attorney appointed to the federal bench in 2003, and admitted in a monotone voice that he had made misrepresentations to financial institutions and engaged in practices that violated federal law. He did not apologize. He did not look at the gallery where I sat with Ayanna and 4 of the other plaintiffs. Judge Langford accepted the plea and scheduled sentencing for June 5th. That's when I'd have my chance to speak. The sentencing hearing lasted 4 hours. 7 people gave victim impact statements before me, including Lucia Fernandez, who described in halting English how the stress of fighting eviction had triggered a stroke that left her partially paralyzed on her left side. Darren Thompson testified about losing his job at the hospital because the harassment and legal proceedings caused him to miss too many shifts, and how he'd spent his entire savings of $8,000 on an attorney before Ayanna took his case pro bono. Jennifer Wu explained that the fear of losing her apartment had triggered such severe anxiety that she'd withdrawn from graduate school and moved back in with her parents in Sacramento. Then it was my turn. I walked to the podium with a single page of handwritten notes, looked at Judge Langford, and began speaking. I told her about the morning I found the eviction notice taped above my grandmother's mezuzah. I told her about the footage of Thornberry crouched outside my door at 4:47 a.m. I told her about the 11 violations, the fabricated complaints, the police visit, the months of documentation and fear and sleepless nights wondering if I'd lose my home. Then I looked directly at Thornberry, sitting at the defense table in an orange prison jumpsuit, and said what I'd been rehearsing for weeks. The courtroom was packed that day, not just with the plaintiffs and their families, but with reporters, housing rights advocates, and other tenants who'd been following the case. My parents had flown in from Seattle, sitting in the second row with my Aunt Ayanna beside them. I hadn't wanted them there at first, hadn't wanted them to hear the details of what I'd been through, but my mother had insisted. "We're your family," she'd said on the phone. "You don't go through something like this alone." My father had taken the week off work, something he almost never did. They'd listened to Lucia's testimony, to Darren's, to Jennifer's, their faces growing more strained with each story. When my name was called, my mother squeezed my hand as I stood up. The walk to the podium felt like miles. I could feel Thornberry's presence at the defense table even before I looked at him, a weight in the room, a void where empathy should have been. His attorneys had coached him to appear remorseful, I could tell. He kept his head slightly bowed, his hands folded on the table. But when I started speaking, when I described that morning with the eviction notice, I saw his jaw tighten. When I mentioned the camera footage of him outside my door, his fingers twitched. He didn't want to hear this. He didn't want to be confronted with the human cost of what he'd done. That's what made it essential that I say it. After I finished my statement and returned to my seat, there was a moment of silence in the courtroom. Judge Langford was reviewing her notes. Thornberry's lead attorney, Jeffrey Ashford, looked like he wanted to object to something but couldn't figure out what. The prosecutor, Assistant United States Attorney Rachel Bowen, had tears in her eyes. She'd later tell me that in 23 years of prosecuting white-collar crime, she'd rarely seen such clear-cut evidence of discriminatory intent combined with such devastating personal impact. Then Judge Langford began her sentencing remarks. She spoke for 18 minutes, methodically dismantling every argument Thornberry's defense had made about his motivations being purely financial rather than racial. She cited specific emails, specific violation notices, specific patterns in his targeting of tenants. She noted that Thornberry had shown calculated cruelty in his timing, delivering violation notices when tenants were most vulnerable, scheduling confrontations during work hours or family emergencies, using the police and legal system as weapons rather than protections. She pointed out that he'd had countless opportunities to stop, after our cease and desist letter, after the DFEH investigation began, after the federal charges were filed, but instead, he'd doubled down, attempted to destroy evidence, and tried to intimidate witnesses. "Mr. Thornberry," she said, looking directly at him, "you didn't just break the law. You weaponized it against the vulnerable for profit. You used your position as a landlord, a position of power over people's homes and safety, to perpetrate a systematic campaign of racial discrimination, and when caught, you showed no remorse, only calculation about how to minimize your losses. Mr. Thornberry, you didn't just try to evict me, you tried to erase me. You looked at my last name, my skin color, and decided I didn't belong in a building I'd called home for a year. You manufactured lies about who I was and what I'd done because you saw me as an obstacle to profit, not as a human being with a life and a family and a right to exist in my own apartment. You did this to me. You did this to Lucia and Darren and Jennifer and 8 other people whose only crime was existing in spaces you wanted for wealthier, whiter tenants. You used the police against us. You weaponized documentation against us. You tried to use the power of law and authority and institutional systems to make us disappear quietly so you could make money. But we didn't disappear. We fought back. And now you're here, in this courtroom, facing the consequences of believing that some people matter less than your profit margin. I hope the next 5 years in prison give you time to think about what you did and who you harmed, and whether any amount of money was worth destroying the lives of 11 families. I hope you think about me every single day." Judge Langford sentenced Gerald Thornberry to 78 months in federal prison, 10 months more than the prosecution's recommendation, followed by 3 years supervised release, $4.3 million in restitution, and a lifetime ban on obtaining FHA-backed financing for any real estate transactions. In her sentencing remarks, she noted that Thornberry's crimes represented a calculated campaign of racial discrimination disguised as property management, enabled by institutional systems designed to protect landlords over tenants, and motivated entirely by greed. She also noted that Thornberry had shown no genuine remorse during the proceedings and had attempted to blame his attorneys and business partners for decisions he'd made personally. The sentence was one of the longest ever handed down in a federal housing discrimination case in California. I watched Thornberry's face as the judge spoke. He didn't react. He just stared straight ahead, shoulders slumped, as marshals approached to escort him out of the courtroom. His wife and 2 adult children sat in the back row. They didn't look at him as he passed. I moved out of the Meridian Lofts on August 1st, not because I had to. My 5-year lease guarantee was still in effect, but because I'd spent 11 months living in an apartment that felt like a crime scene. Every time I walked past the spot where that first violation notice had been taped to my door, I felt my chest tighten. Every time I heard footsteps in the hallway at odd hours, I checked the camera feed on my phone. The trauma didn't end when the settlement was signed or when Thornberry went to prison. It just changed shape. Ayanna had warned me about this too. She'd said, "Justice in court doesn't erase what they put you through. You're going to carry this for a long time." I found a new apartment in Berkeley, a smaller place near campus that cost more than I wanted to pay, but felt safe in a way the Meridian Lofts never would again. I kept the doorbell camera from my old apartment. I still check it compulsively, even though it's no longer connected to anything. The moving process itself triggered another wave of panic. Packing up my belongings, seeing the walls of my apartment bare again, reliving that first day when I'd moved in so optimistic about my life in Oakland, it all brought back the fear and anger in ways I hadn't anticipated. Dr. Cross had prepared me for this during our sessions, explaining that major transitions often reactivated trauma responses, even when the transition was positive. She taught me grounding techniques, naming 5 things I could see, 4 I could touch, 3 I could hear. I used them constantly during the move. The day I handed my keys to the building manager, not Thornberry, not Kimberly, but a new manager hired by the nonprofit organization, I sat in my empty apartment for 30 minutes just breathing. This had been my home. Thornberry had tried to steal it from me. I'd fought and won and kept it, and now I was choosing to leave it behind because staying meant living with ghosts. There was grief in that choice, even though it was the right one. Darren helped me move my furniture. Lucia brought me homemade pupusas for lunch. Jennifer wrote me a card that I still keep in my desk drawer. It said, "You saved all of us by refusing to disappear. Thank you for fighting." I cried reading it. The therapy sessions continued through the summer and into fall, shifting from crisis management to long-term processing. Dr. Cross helped me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't just housing discrimination. It was racial trauma, a systematic attack on my sense of safety and belonging in the world. She explained that trauma changes your nervous system, rewires your threat detection, makes you hypervigilant in ways that can't be switched off through willpower alone. We worked on techniques to help my body understand that the danger had passed. EMDR therapy, where I processed traumatic memories while following her finger with my eyes. Somatic experiencing, where I learned to notice and release tension stored in my muscles. Cognitive behavioral approaches to challenge the anxious thoughts that still told me I wasn't safe. Progress was slow and nonlinear. Some weeks I felt almost normal. Other weeks I'd wake up at 3 a.m., convinced I heard someone at my door, heart pounding, hands shaking, trapped in a flashback to those early mornings when Thornberry's violation notices appeared like threats from an invisible enemy. Dr. Cross never rushed me. She just kept showing up, session after session, holding space for the anger and fear and grief until I could hold it myself. The $200,000 from the settlement sat in my bank account for 3 months before I figured out what to do with it. Part of me wanted to spend it on something frivolous, a car I didn't need, a vacation to somewhere far away, anything that felt like reclaiming my life from the shadow of Gerald Thornberry's harassment. But that felt hollow. Instead, I donated $100,000 to the Bay Area Legal Aid, the organization where Ayanna had started her career, specifically to fund their tenant defense program. The other $100,000 went into a trust fund I established with Ayanna's help, designed to provide emergency legal assistance to tenants facing discrimination or wrongful eviction in Oakland. The fund is called the Meridian Defense Initiative, named after the building where 11 families almost lost their homes because one man saw them as obstacles instead of people. Ayanna manages it pro bono. In its first year, the fund helped 32 families fight wrongful evictions. 18 of them won. The Meridian Defense Initiative's first case came just 6 weeks after we established the fund. A single mother named Keisha Roberts reached out through the website we'd created, explaining that her landlord in West Oakland was trying to evict her and her 2 children using fabricated lease violations nearly identical to what we'd experienced. Noise complaints with no evidence, accusations of unauthorized occupants, claims of property damage that didn't exist. Ayanna took the case immediately and discovered the landlord was using the same property management company that had worked for Thornberry before his arrest. The same playbook, the same template violation notices, the same targeting of black single mothers on rent-controlled leases. We won Keisha's case in housing court within 8 weeks, and the judge was so appalled by the evidence that he not only dismissed the eviction, but sanctioned the landlord and ordered him to pay Keisha's legal fees. That victory led to 3 more referrals from other tenants in the same building. By December, we were handling 6 active cases. By March, we'd expanded to provide Know Your Rights workshops in community centers across Oakland, teaching tenants how to document harassment, recognize illegal eviction tactics, and access legal resources before situations reached crisis point. Lucia became one of our volunteer workshop leaders, sharing her story in Spanish and English to immigrant communities who faced the same targeting she'd survived. Darren worked with veteran service organizations to connect disabled veterans facing housing discrimination with legal support. Jennifer developed an online resource hub with template letters, documentation checklists, and contact information for housing attorneys willing to take pro bono cases. The impact on the other plaintiffs varied. Lucia stayed in her apartment at the Meridian Lofts and became something of a matriarch for the building, organizing social events and checking in on new residents to make sure they felt welcome. Her health improved once the stress of the eviction threat ended, though she still struggled with mobility issues from the stroke. Darren moved out 6 months after the settlement, taking his $50,000 and relocating to Sacramento, where he'd found work as a security consultant and could be closer to his adult daughter and grandchildren. He called me on his moving day and said, "I fought for this country overseas, and I had to fight for it again just to keep my apartment. I'm tired of fighting. I just want to rest now." I understood that completely. Jennifer finished her graduate program. She'd taken a semester off during the height of the legal proceedings and got her PhD in environmental engineering. She accepted a tenure-track position at a university in Oregon and moved in August, but she came back to Oakland for the 1-year anniversary of the settlement to speak at a Meridian Tenants Alliance meeting about the importance of standing up to discrimination even when it feels impossible. Several of the other plaintiffs stayed in the building, now managed by the nonprofit organization, with actual competent maintenance staff and no harassment. 2 of them joined the board of the Meridian Defense Initiative. One of them, a man named Robert Lewis, who'd been targeted for suspicious financial transactions. He'd been depositing cash tips from his job as a restaurant server, became a community organizer himself, working with the Oakland Tenants Union to push for stronger citywide protections against landlord harassment. 6 months after Thornberry's sentencing, I received a letter forwarded through Ayanna's office. It was from Thornberry, handwritten on prison stationery, postmarked from the Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin, California. The letter was 2 pages long. It began with an apology, not the carefully worded legal document his attorneys had crafted for the press release, but something that sounded almost human. He wrote that he'd spent months in prison replaying his decisions, trying to understand how he'd convinced himself that what he was doing was acceptable. He wrote that he'd grown up poor, that he'd built his business from nothing, and that somewhere along the way he'd started measuring success only in profit margins and property values. He wrote that he was ashamed of what he'd done to me and the other tenants, and that no amount of time in prison would undo the harm he'd caused. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just said he wanted me to know that I'd been right in the courtroom. He did think about me every day, and he would for the rest of his life. I read the letter twice. Then I shredded it and threw it away. I still work from home as a software developer. I still make cookies occasionally and leave them in the mailroom of my building. I still check my doorbell camera too often, and I still flinch when I see official-looking documents slipped under my door. But I also know something now that I didn't know before Gerald Thornberry tried to erase me from the Meridian lofts. I am not invisible. I am not powerless. And when people with authority and money and institutional systems try to make me disappear because of who I am, there are tools to fight back. Lawyers like my aunt who've spent their lives preparing for exactly these battles. Investigators who take discrimination seriously, laws that protect tenants even when landlords forget they exist, and courts that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, actually deliver justice. Thornberry didn't just lose a legal case. He lost his business, his freedom, his reputation, and his future. I lost 4 months of sleep and the sense of safety in my home. But I'm still here. That's what he didn't count on. I'm still here. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.